Hello, everybody, and I am going to switch gears dramatically from the Middle East and from politics to a literary classic, Don Quixote, its impact on the world in general, and the way one can use it as a mirror to understand the current dilemma on immigrants, refugees, exiles, and people on the move. I have literally less than 15 minutes to make a pitch for my favorite book, a book that I spent semesters complete to analyze it in great detail. Of all the books that I have read, many, it is by far the most interesting, the most inclusive, the most daring, the most lasting. It is the book that I would take with me to another island and spend there for the rest of my life, rereading it as I do every year. And it is also a book that if there is a heaven or a hell, I would like to have next to me in order to escape the reality of that would be surrounding me. Why is this book so important? It is more than 400 years old. It is a book that was written at a time of imperial decline, when writing was presented as an alternative escape to the dire situation that was taking place in Spain in the 17th century. And mostly it was written by a writer who was considered to be second-rate or third-rate. He was mostly a poet, a playwright. He had tried his luck doing short novels, never imagined that he would write a long novel, and he also considered himself to be, first and foremost, a soldier. He wanted to be remembered as the great soldier of the Spanish War against the Turks, the Battle of Lepanto, where he lost control of one of his arms. And ironically, as in the case of Shakespeare, we consider that period the period of Cervantes. We call it the Cervantean Age, La Edad de Cervantes, the way we also talk about Shakespeare as the leading figure of the Elizabethan period. Cervantes never imagined that he would write a long novel. We don't know, we don't have any manuscript, we don't have any letters, we don't have any diaries, we don't have any interviews, we don't have any marginalia of books that he read, but we do know, simply by detective work that some of us literary scholars and historians have been doing, that he probably started writing a short novel, didn't even imagine that it would have two main characters, but only one, Don Quixote, and that probably when he was reaching the 8th or 9th chapter, he realized that this was something that merited much more, that it allowed for a greater vision of what his world was about, and he introduced a kind of sidekick to the tall, slim, idealistic Don Quixote in the short, obese, down-to-earth, foul-mouthed character of Sancho Panza. And since then, we really have the two characters navigating not only through the novel, but through history. So many other characters have been based on Don Quixote and Sancho. Ernie and Bert in Sesame Street, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, R2-D2 and C3PO. There are so many that have imagined that those two characters, polar opposites in the way they conceive and perceive the world, are really the two friends, and this is a book about friendship, the two friends that represent the gamut of the human experience, what it is to be human, and how does one approach the world. Don Quixote approaches it as a dreamer. He believes that the world that he sees is a world that is incomplete, that needs to be improved. And his mission, his pursuit in life, is to complete that work, that world that is falling apart. And he goes out to mend it, to improve it, to make it whole. Whereas Sancho has no interest in fixing the world. Sancho wants to be paid, he wants to eat, he wants to sleep, he wants to take a bath, he wants to be with his wife and children. He is a man of this world and not of the other world, the imaginary world. And the whole novel is really the dialogue between the two. Nothing else, and really an extraordinary amount of communication between them, how one is trying to persuade the other that the world is a dream, and how the other one is trying to persuade the first one that actually the world is as is and we can't really change it. Why is it that this book has become so important? And here I want to invite you to think of what a literary classic is. Mark Twain once said that a literary classic is a book that everybody knows but nobody reads. And the perfect example is Don Quixote. If you ask people if they have read Don Quixote, most people will tell you that they maybe have a copy, that they read 2-3 chapters, that they couldn't go beyond, they stumbled, and after that, they realized that they didn't really need to read it anymore because everybody was telling them what the book was about. Everybody would complete the story by watching Man of La Mancha, or by going to see this ballet, or that opera, or this theater piece. It is a work of art that has been adapted to so many other arts, into sculpture, into painting, into movies, that really, in many ways, we have stolen away from Cervantes his work, and we don't do anything but reinterpret it time and time again from different perspectives and from different cultures. One of the fascinating approaches to Don Quixote is that every culture really looks at it from a different perspective. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson had it as their favorite book. It was in Washington's deathbed when he died. And they thought that this Don Quixote, the book that contains him, is really the story of an individualist, a man who's committed to the private enterprise and who is going to go at it at any cost. The Soviets, on the other hand, believed he is a fighter for the oppressed. He is a member of the lower class that wants to rise up and take away the power and control from those that have it. And they believed that this was the most Soviet, most communist of all novels ever. And the contrast between the two shows you the degree to which a literary classic can be interpreted in so many different ways. And it's really the same book, but the differences are dramatic. And in that sense, I invite you to think of another definition of literary classic, which is a book that really depends on the reader to finish it. And I'm going to offer yet another one that is different, in contrast with books that are published today and that perish today too, that is, that they are read in the present and they don't go beyond the present. A literary classic is a book that waits for us patiently. It's a book that chooses its readers and knows that sometimes a reader will not be necessarily ready at a particular time and will return to that book at some point. My very first time reading Don Quixote was just a frustration. I was 19 years old. My father had told me to read Don Quixote, and because my father told me, I thought I should open it. I closed it very quickly and threw it away. And today I have a vast collection of Quixote books. There are 22 translations of Don Quixote into English. No other literary classic, aside from the Bible, has been translated so many times. I have all of them, and many of them in the first edition too. I have versions of Don Quixote in languages I don't read: Korean, Swahili, Nahuatl, and it's because I feel that my world is really populated by the various versions of Don Quixote, and that in many ways, a literary classic is a friend that travels with you in life and that changes as you change every time you open it. William Faulkner said once that if there was a book that he wanted to continue reading every year, and he said that he read it every year, and that was Don Quixote. Dostoevsky based several of his novels on this book. Flaubert's Madame Bovary is said to be Don Quixote in skirts. The Huckleberry Finn is the story of a runaway slave and a child that is Don Quixote and Sancho in the United States. And Hemingway loved it, Fitzgerald loved it. This is a book that really attracts many. Let me conclude, because I really have so little time, not a semester in front of me. Let me conclude by telling you that one of the powerful elements for me of Don Quixote is the fact that it really speaks to the age of immigration and of mass movement from one part of the world into another. Don Quixote at the very beginning is an idle nobleman, an hidalgo. The word means hijo de algo, not really having clear roots, and spending your time having inherited money from family or from the nobility, but not having a purpose in life, reading and reading and reading until he realizes that he wants to be like one of the characters in the books that he reads, the chivalry novels. And he becomes one because he believes like Amadis de Gaul or any other knights of olden days, it is proper for him to go out and help those in need. He dresses himself with whatever rags he finds in his closet. He goes and dresses also his skinny horse and starts galloping. And this is really the very first travel road novel, the book that transits from different parts of Spain and gives us a vision of what Spain is all about at that time. But the beauty of the book, in the contradiction of the book, is that this is probably the most important Spanish novel ever written, and yet it is an authentically and kind of viciously anti-Spanish book. Cervantes offers a vision of Spain that is so critical, so cruel and so crude, and so to the point that one gets the sense that, as Nabokov once said, that nobody wants to be in Spain at that time. And what does Don Quixote do? He goes from one place to another, trying to convince them that they can change their approach to prisoners, to women that had been battered, to children. And by going and trying to persuade others, he believes that his evangelical mission is being accomplished. And in that, he becomes a traveler. He becomes an immigrant from one place to another, and he starts adapting to the elements of those particular places and reconfiguring them, the way we talk about assimilation or acculturation, that is what immigrants and refugees and exiles experience. If you read Don Quixote from beginning to end, you find something really extraordinary. This is called the very first modern novel. And it is modern because the character shows up at the beginning in one particular way and ends up at the end in a very different way. That is, he undergoes a transformation. He is no longer the same person. He is different, and hopefully he is also better. He is also undergoing a transformation in a way that he didn't suspect. And that is that in his dialogue with Sancho, he becomes Sanchified. He becomes much more down to earth, whereas Sancho becomes more Quixoticized. There is a kind of transmutation or transubstantiation that takes place between the two. And I think that's the meaning of true friendship, or maybe marriage, or a relationship that you have with somebody else. You become like the other person, and the other person becomes like you. But it also entails what it means to be an immigrant. You become like the country or the place that you arrive to, and also the place is transformed by the Quixote presence that has been around at that time. My last words, if you haven't read Don Quixote, I think this is the pitch. It is a book that will, at the beginning, try to scare you, and eventually will suck you in. There are a variety of translations. I recommend the only woman who has ever translated Don Quixote of the 22, Edith Grossman, who modernizes the book. And finally, you'll realize that a classic is a book that can really rebuild a sense of self, not only in the two characters, but in the readers. I know from experience with students, with prisoners in jails, where I read Don Quixote, that people at the very end are so transformed as to believe that they do have dreams and they can change the world. Thank you. Thank you, Richard.